Game theory is a mathematical model that was invented by the American scientist John von Neumann. Game theory outlines the method or strategy that's involved in a game comprising two players. The result of an action by each of the players is then weighed by a response or a reaction from the other player. And so you build a series of permutations and combinations to deduce what is the most likely set of actions and reactions leading to outcomes. It helps you arrive at a conclusion depending on what is likely to be the most compelling set of actions and outcomes. On this week's Crux Decode, we try to use game theory to analyze what could be Vladimir Putin's next move. Will the conflict escalate or will it lead to a negotiated settlement? Now, in this game, we have two players. Putin, who is the principal protagonist, and you have the West, who are the antagonists. Now, let's characterize all of Putin's actions as A1 or A2 or A3. In any given circumstance, Putin can take any of two actions, depending on whether he wants to escalate or whether he wants to de-escalate the conflict. Similarly, the West can respond or react to Putin's moves. Let's call them R1 or R2 or R3, depending on whether the West chooses to match Putin, escalation for escalation, or whether they choose to not join issue with him and thereby de-escalate. So let's start from the top. Putin's first action, A1, which was when he started the conflict with Ukraine back on the 24th of February. The reason why he chose A1 and not A2 was because A2 would have meant a continuation of the status quo, which is that NATO continues to expand eastwards, thereby threatening Russia's security interests. So status quo was not acceptable to Putin. He did not want NATO to expand and include Ukraine as a member. That's why he chose A1, which was to go to war with Ukraine. Now, how does the West respond to this? Reaction 1 or R1, which is to confront Russia with sanctions and giving military aid to Ukraine so as to take on Russia directly. Now, the reason why the West chose R1, which is to confront Russia, and not R2, was simply because that R2 would mean that if the West did nothing in response to Putin, then Putin would win. So that would set a precedent that every time Vladimir Putin wanted his way, all he needed to do was use force, and that would ensure that NATO and the West succumb. So the West chooses R1, which is to match Putin's escalation. But on the ground, as far as the military operation is concerned, Putin simply has no choice but to choose A5 and ensure that he goes all the way till there is a military victory. Now, how does Putin respond to this? He chooses A3, which is to escalate further, send in more heavy weaponry, ensure that the war goes on for weeks and months. Now, the consequence of all of this is that Putin loses international credibility, Russia loses its standing. But is that too high a price to pay? Well, the way Putin sees it, that's not quite high a price enough. Because if he were to choose A4, which is to scale back, not to escalate further, but scale back, then that means that Putin would stand to lose the war. Remember, this is a war that he started, and his stated objective before starting the war was to change the status quo, to stop NATO from expanding. So therefore, A4, which is to de-escalate or scale back, is not an option for Putin. So Putin chooses A3 and he escalates further. Now, how does the West respond to this? If the West were to choose R4, which is to escalate and join issue with Putin, which is to send NATO troops to join in the war, then the West becomes a direct party in this conflict. This now becomes a direct confrontation between Putin and NATO. This is no longer a war between Goliath and David. This is no longer Russia versus Ukraine. This is straight up NATO versus Putin. Now, NATO clearly does not want that, because that, for all practical purposes, will lead to World War III, and that is not something that any party wants. So the West instead chooses a continuation of R1, which is R3, meaning more sanctions, more military equipment, possibly cutting off gas supplies, etc., in trying to help Ukraine fight this war. But by choosing R3, the West is also clearly sending out a signal to Ukraine, look, this is your war to fight, this is not our fight. Also remember, very importantly, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Now, had Ukraine been a member of NATO, then the West would not have had a choice but to choose R4, which is to escalate and join the war directly, because as per Chapter 5 of the NATO Charter, an attack on one is an attack on all. So, if Ukraine were a full-fledged member of NATO, then NATO would have no choice but to enter this war actively with boots on the ground. Right now, they have the luxury of choosing R3, which is not to join issue, not to further escalate, not match Putin's escalation ladder, by simply continuing with R1, which is R3 or reaction 3. Now, how does Putin respond to reaction 3? If he were to choose A5, which is to continue this war for many, many weeks and months, remember, people are talking about, civil insurgency, they're talking about urban warfare, guerrilla warfare, and we've seen examples of how guerrilla warfare has brought down the mightiest of armies, or at least kept them completely engaged and completely hooked in and drawn in for months and years out at large. So that would mean not just committing a significant number of Russian troops and armory, but also that would mean, as a fallout, a significant number of civilian casualties. And eventually, that would mean Russia would face complete global isolation. Russia would become, for all practical purposes, like a pariah state in the Global Committee of Nations. Russia is brought down or reduced to the same league as Iran and North Korea, because the entire West, and that's one thing that you've seen in the response from Europe in particular. If there's one thing that Europe has done in responding to Vladimir Putin, is to stay united and unified in their response. So it's almost like Vladimir Putin has given the West, and in particular Europe, a very reason for its existence, a reason for it to rally around. So that means that Putin continues to escalate. There is a tough sanctions regime against him and the Russian government, as also the various oligarchs who are supporting his regime. Putin and Russia have to face international isolation as well. But on the ground, as far as the military operation is concerned, Putin simply has no choice but to choose A5 and ensure that he goes all the way till there is a military victory. At the end of that military victory, he will have to get Zelensky to either surrender, or he will have to find a situation where Zelensky is eliminated, or he doesn't have to deal with Zelensky anymore. There is already a regime change in Kiev, and the West and NATO will have to agree to that change of regime. A regime that is more amenable to the Kremlin. You've already seen reports of Viktor Yanukovych, the previous president of Ukraine, apparently being cited in Minsk. And Minsk, remember, is where the famous Minsk peace agreements, both 1 and 2, came into existence in 2014 and 15. So, is it possible that Putin chooses A5 and then eventually, after a military victory, installs his man, Viktor Yanukovych, in the saddle of power in Kiev? The big question, though, is, would Putin have relegated his own country to the status of a pariah state like North Korea and Iran? And is that a price that is worth enough to pay for Vladimir Putin to achieve whatever his military objectives are? Now, how does the West respond to this? It chooses R5, which is to climb down, agree to a regime change, because remember, in the previous set of options, we said that the West does not want to join issue with Putin. Therefore, they're not going to be joining this war actively, and therefore R4 for them is not an option. So now it chooses R5, which is to accept a regime change, accept that Putin has won this war militarily, but agree to change the Ukrainian regime. If nothing else will be achieved by it, at least it will stop the immediate bloodshed. In the process, the West would have also ensured that Russia is facing the most severe sanctions that any country has faced since the end of the Second World War. It will also have to give a guarantee that Ukraine will not be admitted as a member of NATO, but in the process, and this is the most likely outcome, is that the West would have to agree to split Ukraine into two, East Ukraine and West Ukraine. Putin controls the East. The West has a regime that's more amenable to NATO, much like we had East and West Germany after the World War. The net result is that 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, we will be going back to the days of the Cold War. The Iron Curtain drops once again. History would have just repeated itself. That seems to be the most likely outcome of Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine.